We all need to work more with each other instead of next to each other. That is the essence of what Ulrike Ziegler thinks is missing in aviation decarbonization. Ulrike is our very first guest on Impactful Voices, and I could not be more excited to have her opening this episode and this format as an impactful voice. A warm welcome to everyone who tuned in. I'm Leonie, the host of Impactful Voices, a podcast format hosted by Impact on Sustainable Aviation, where we want to bring industry leaders across the whole aviation ecosystem together. Ulrike Ziegler is a lawyer by training with a PhD in law. However, she's worked most time of her life in finance. With decades of experience in aviation finance, Ulrike in 2022 took the leap and jumped onto Impact and now is the president of the board of directors of Impact. And ever since that, she's been running it and chasing the challenges of aviation decarbonization. That's also why I think there could have been no one else than Ulrike to be on this very first episode. And I'm really happy that we made this work. So I'm going to leave it here and with that move on to the conversation with Ulrike. Hello, Ulrike.
Hi, lovely to meet you, Leonie.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited that you have agreed to being on this podcast. I mean, you more or less agreed. I kind of just made it your task to be our pilot episode. I think because there's no one else that would be better suited to just like launch off Impactful Voices, because who is the main voice behind Impact? It is you. And therefore, I'm really excited that you agreed and we can talk about this today.
Looking forward.
So let's start kind of a little bit back in time. I mean, the spectrum of the stakeholders that Impact is working with today has kind of broadened and significantly expanded since the founding of Impact. Can you maybe take us back a little bit to the time when Impact was founded in 2022 and explain why a platform like Impact was needed at the time from an aviation finance standpoint?
Perfect, more than happy to. Well, I guess we need to take a long step back. I think everything started really with the Paris Agreement and then had the EU ETS scheme introduced. CORSIA was actually surfacing in the 2010s. So it was a natural buildup of momentum, which translated into aviation's net zero commitment. And then for us banks, the EU taxonomy really, made us put more scrutiny on the industries and the portfolios that we're going to finance. And obviously had the external stakeholders just as well, right, who wanted to understand how the enabler, i.e. the banks, the financiers, are doing their business and what kind of business they conduct. And also taking a bit of a step back, looking at the mid-2010s, late 2010s, the public showed an enormous interest in, more sustainability. You remember the Fridays for Future movements that we saw. And I guess ultimately, aviation is an extremely visible industry. Most of us have been on an airplane. We see airplanes, we see the contrails. And obviously, I think we're kind of the perfect almost victim to be pointed at, for the pollution that we're causing, albeit it's only 2 to 3% if we're looking at the CO2 emissions. And I guess another important stepstone was the CSRD, which introduced substantial reporting requirements, and many stakeholders had to really sit back and understand what they're supposed to deliver. They're just naming double materiality. I know companies spend years and lots of money on understanding how to best, put that into their reporting scheme. And for us as financiers, so going back to what we've been seeing, is really that we were not in a position to understand how the aviation industry, how our clients are progressing when it comes to decarbonization and how they're dealing with it. There was this one, we were cognizant of the absence of standardization and transparency on airlines' emissions reporting. And many people heard me say that over and over again. But it's only, a small percentage of airlines that do report, albeit that the capacity covered, by the airlines that do report is quite massive. It was also, I guess, we looked at third-party pathways, that would ideally lead us to net zero aviation. We saw these wonderful wedge charts that would depict what the role of SAF is, how much, we can do on contrail avoidance, emissions, operational efficiency, carbon removal, whatsoever else. But I think that created a false sense of security because these, party pathways, they're built on carbon budgets. And these carbon budgets, by definition, come with quite a degree of uncertainty. And we've seen, quite some adjustments in recent years. So this is not something that's reliable. And as I alluded to, why did we have adjustments? Because these carbon budgets were based on numerous assumptions which have to be revisited as we take stock of more information and scientific learning. Another challenge that we faced is that the industry was a strong user of the intensity KPI, so that's CO2 over a traffic unit, which is a very important metric. I dare say, it gave us some guidance over the last couple of decades that the industry is running their operations more efficiently. That means burning less fuel per kilometer or mile flown. Having said that, at the same time, we obviously saw that the industry has increased the fleet. We've been talking about doubling the fleet for the last couple of I wouldn't say the last couple, but more than 20, 25 years at least since I've been in business. And so whatever efficiency gains we had were overcompensated by the, doubling of the fleet, so having more aircraft in the air. So what was the key consideration for us really as impact and being quite some major lenders, as I would like to mention ING, MUFG, Natixis, Bank of China, KfW. For us, a key consideration was really we need to find a basis that allows us to track the sustainability developments of an airline. That means actually in this case the decarbonization. And what we had in mind is put something in place that makes life a lot easier for everyone while enabling us to manage risk and make informed decisions. So pillar number one was, measure what needs to be measured. And it's not the intensity that needs to be measured because that, might send a false message. It's actually the progress towards decarbonization. The next pillar was simplicity. So we only need two data points that the airline already has readily available, which is CO2 and a traffic unit. That in and of itself already reduces quite some reporting burden and cost because you see airlines had to build up quite some sustainability teams or quite some people in their sustainability teams to address all the reporting burden. We don't have time for that. They're there to fly and we're here, to actually support the industry as financiers. The next pillar, the third one, is staying away from the assumption-heavy third pathways. They're not fit for purpose in the sense of integrating them into a finance or lease contract, which can run up to 12 years, right? Because they're subject to change. And the last thing you want to have is that, one of the parties to a contract, be it a loan, be it a lease, actually goes back and says, listen, there was a change in the underlying assumptions that we need to revisit what we have in the finance or loan agreement. And then lastly, I think a very, very important point which has gets quite some attention is the reduction of the greenwashing risk. And we think with these two data points and the milestone concept, that's what we call actually our methodology. We're on a very sound footing. And I think it's very important also for those people watching. The milestone concept has been scientifically vetted. It's getting quite some traction from multiple stakeholders in the industry, to really drill down on, as I said, what needs to be measured and allow everyone to understand whether progress is being made or not. And so, well, in a nutshell, I think the story was so compelling that we have managed to become the largest sustainability focus group in aviation finance.
Okay, so basically having started from aviation finance, the core idea or driver was because you all were, who started Impact together, coming from a finance background, is more future-proofing and de-risking the business of aviation finance. But therefore, obviously, you kind of had to reach out and see how can we decarbonize those stakeholders that are in our value chain, right? Absolutely. And so was that basically the main driver that caused this shift as well from moving and including more and more different stakeholders in Impact and also expanding the work on different focus areas? Let's say different topics like SAF, we're working a lot on SAF right now. Is that still contributing to that idea and finance kind of building the base, or how would you explain that?
Well, that's a very good question, Leonie. I guess it really starts with the idea that finance has a core role to play, right? As I usually say, we're the center of gravity and money makes the world go around. Aviation is a very capital intensive business. So our airlines, lessor clients, they need money from banks, from investors, from the capital markets to support their core needs in terms of building their business, buying aircraft. At the same time, aviation's transition that we see is going to be also very capital intensive. We will need thousands of SAF plants, we need direct air capture, we need to work on contrail. We'll see new aircraft technology that needs to be financed, right? And the last pillar, I guess, is also the infrastructure. Who could possibly be the convening party around all of that? Because we're connected to all the core stakeholders, airlines, lessors, and the broad decarbonization supply chain, including infrastructure. So I think we are the go-to point to connect all these stakeholders. We have a good understanding, I guess, of their business, of their approach to risk, their approach to opportunities. And so, I guess that also caused ultimately the shift of impact a bit to look at the broader stakeholder group. And why is that? Aviation's transition has a high level of complexity. We have so many stakeholders involved. As I said, this starts with regulation. We have SAF, we have CDR, we have the contrails, aircraft technology, infrastructure, whatever else. So it's all kind of intertwined and connected. And that's what I would call the new normal ultimately, right? And historically, I guess our business was a bit easier. I mean, we had an airline. You looked at financing planes and the core business of an airline. Looked at the kerosene, what the cash balance was and what the business model was and whether the load factor stacked up. Again, that's putting it very, very simplistically. But having said that, that also gives you a sense of what the new normal looked like that I described initially. And so that's why we decided we need to take a more holistic view, be the convener and bring all these parties together and understand the pain points that all of us have and also where we have overlaps that we can work upon and really lever towards, decarbonization of aviation and making it ultimately a very successful business for all stakeholders.
Yeah. So speaking of pain points, you just touched on it. I mean, you're around participating in a lot of industry conferences, stakeholder events, and of course, you're in touch there with a lot of the different stakeholder groups and many different actors facing the challenges of the transition from different angles. So when you speak about pain points and the different stakeholders, is there something that when you talk to all these different actors that you could identify as kind of like a core problem that everyone's facing, that you can see connecting them all, regardless whether they're SAF producers or an airline or CDR developers?
Mm-hmm. Interesting question. I don't think it's as easy as that. I think the very common or the key observation I would have is really that we still have to acknowledge the breadth of the aviation decarbonization supply chain and have an understanding how all these stakeholders or all the projects are intertwined. And that's what I'm personally, again, this is my very personal opinion, that's what I'm missing. We're still kind of, many of us stay within their bubbles and we might talk to another stakeholder, another two stakeholders, but there's hardly anyone that's bringing everyone to the same table. And obviously with the lack of understanding thereof, lots of organizations like Impact even, have formed. Some work more on enabling finance, others work more on the policy side of things. The next ones are working on SAF. And so I dare say that we see quite some efforts being duplicated, not well coordinated, and obviously I question if we kind of exist next to each other rather than, really working together, whether all the key concern of the stakeholders are considered and have been considered. And obviously this is neither effective nor efficient to have that high degree of fragmentation. So I'm a very strong advocate of transition is extremely complex, and that in and of itself actually, requires to take a very holistic view, understand the role of the various stakeholders, understand how their role evolves, how their business evolves. I don't think, the business, the way we've done it over the last couple of decades will continue because we have so many moving targets and variables. But beyond, what I said, we're not as efficient and as effective as we were hoping to be. I think by more coordinating and being more, intertwined, we should also be able to really realize, business opportunities out there, right? Because we interact more with the various stakeholders and understand, what kind of risks are emerging, to understand how can the risk fairly distributed across the broader aviation decarbonization supply chain. and really to build a sound understanding of that ecosystem. I think that's a very high priority for me as a person, and I guess also quite some extent for impact.
So really much not necessarily bringing more and more efforts out there, because they are there, is what you're saying. People are working on the right things. It's just that there's not enough coordination and collaboration. So instead of duplicating just things, it's more creating synergies and more efficiency at scale. Is that?
Absolutely.
And how do you see then impact's role in that context? So how can impact contribute to bringing these different perspectives to the same underlying challenge in the end, that is the transition, and to get it right? So how can impact facilitate that? And what is currently missing to close this gap that you just described? And how can impact potentially help to close that gap?
That's quite a bit of pressure saying, how do you
You're here for that.
Right, exactly. Yeah, but I guess I would probably refer to what I said earlier. Finance is a key facilitator of the transition. We have an enabling role. And, as I said, most of the members that we have, the financiers, they're connected with all the relevant parties. Obviously, they're talking to infrastructure, they're talking to the new energy finance, so talking SAF, they're looking at CDR, and they have I think, they're on a very good way to develop a very sound understanding. And we can set a tone by being involved early on in terms of what's financially feasible and doable and what is not. I think that's a very strong signal that we can send, to all these upcoming industries and projects, to provide feedback very early on in terms of its feasibility. To really be as effective as we can, such an industry-wide neutral hub without any kind of lobbying ideas behind it, but truly just focus on what needs to happen, who needs to do what, to bring us forward as a broader industry. It's probably the best way of jointly creating solutions together.
And when we're talking about then kind of rolling that out and in the future working more together, collaborating more, do you see the most, a few, I don't want to say the most important lever, because I think that's aviation's transition is just too complex for that. But what are the main important levers that need to move right now? Because of course there's a lot of things that kind of you can look ahead and be like, in a few decades that might be something important. But I think I want to hear, what do you think are the most important ones that we need to get supported in the industry right now?
Let me take a step back. To get there and get the support, I think it starts understanding where we stand and how the efforts around net zero decarbonization by 2050 have evolved. And for that to happen, I think you need a very high level of transparency, really clarity on the progress on the various decarbonization levers. Again, we look at these wedge charts, which is a nice way of hopefully having a solution in front of you. But again, this is guidance, not more, not less. And I think, when it comes to SAF, I think as of today, we're already fairly positive that certain types of SAF won't be available to the extent they are needed. Maybe the same on the direct air capture side. I mean, we need to see what happens ultimately. But unless you know where you stand today, you cannot really, move in any direction in a meaningful way. So that's why we've also as Impact taken it upon us to create the Impact Aviation Stocktake Forum that's looking truly at the progress on all these decarbonization levers, understanding the gaps, and ideally form an alliance of the willing to move forward and work on that one. Again, very, very high on my priority list is transparency. Then it's building the connections and the connectivity that we just talked about. Obviously my fellow colleagues at Impact and the members, we're doing our best to bring all these people together, understand the motivation of everyone, and have a very informed discussion on the risks and, ideally how we as financiers can support the industry going forward. And obviously also share our insights, right, on each of the industries that we can always feedback. And that's also creating, lastly, a level of certainty and guidance, which is key to advancing progress. And what do I mean by that? I mean, just reflecting on the discussions that have surfaced in 2025 in the context of Refuel EU review that is scheduled for 2027. We hear quite some voices saying, well, maybe we should push out the mandates, maybe we should water them down. Obviously, we can engage in all these discussions, but the question is, where does it get us? It's not helping us in any case. If nothing else, if an investor hears that, why would the investor put money into a SAF plant, right? I mean, this is really, we need to be mindful what kind of messages we send out. And for me, the simplest is we're a global industry, we have a global issue, and let's work on global solutions and stand united behind that one target and use every effort, use all the lessons learned and the cooperation to really build it. And I'm positive that it can be done. But again, it needs a very concerted effort and a focus on the solution.
When you're saying, just out of curiosity, because you touched on, we need to work together across the globe, basically. I mean, aviation is probably one of the most international, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but since it's just interconnecting the whole world, I think it's one of the most global connected businesses. Is there an administration, a region where you see that they kind of are more progressed that we could look at, and just from a regulatory perspective, maybe here in Europe, take an example from?
Yes, one of my role models is the UK Jet Zero Task Force. They bring all the stakeholders from regulation to infrastructure, to airlines, Contrail, companies working on Contrail, on SAF, on air capture together to really shape the new normal, and it's proven very successful. And I think it has manifested itself, for example, in the UK SAF mandate, where lots of considerations were actually taken into account when putting that together, even going as far as a revenue certainty mechanism, which we in the European Union level don't have. But that seems to be an ecosystem in the UK that is apparently working. At least that's the feedback I get from the multiple discussions I had. And I wish we could amplify that, make it more global. It's certainly not an easy task, right? Because you're dealing with so many different regions, with so many different regulatory backgrounds, cultures. It's not easy to overcome. I think, the cultural barrier as well. But it's definitely worth an effort. One kind of platform that I like is the Global Carbon Capture Institute that brings also numerous stakeholders together, from regulation to production companies, I think to financiers. It's really focusing on lessons learned, understanding each other's pain points. And I'm wondering, why can't we do that when it comes to aviation, and more holistically, or maybe also on certain matters, be it just like a SAF hub, be it just something on Contrail. But again, even if it was separated, we also need to understand how it's all interconnected with each other. So again, probably more a big dream than a reality. But as always, you need to aim high to some extent to really, make a meaningful contribution.
Exactly. I was just gonna say, maybe just a big dream yet. Thank you, Ulrike. So what I get from this conversation is definitely that we need in aviation to reach our goal. Reaching net zero by 2050 is really working more closely together, because there's really smart heads out there, experts working on great things and technologies and policies that can work, but it has to be more coordinated to, in the end, achieve the right outcome. Mm-hmm. And I think on a small scale, we're kind of trying to do that with Impactful Voices now, getting people on here that have really insightful opinions or views or knowledge on specific topics, but from different angles, and maybe ideally interconnect them afterwards as well. That would be great.
Touch wood. So maybe if you allow me one kind of closing note as well, because obviously, going back to what I referenced to earlier, talk about the omnibus or the CSRD, I should actually say, where companies were overwhelmed with, reporting requirements and just using up so much manpower on that one. I think we need to be very mindful that it's not data or reporting that in and of itself is bad, is getting the right data, right? Because that's where the value ultimately lies. It's not about the reporting. It's really understanding and leveraging the data that you get, that gets reported, that enables you to act early, minimize risk, and make informed decision making, but also have very informed client engagement. So data will continue to play a very important role. But let's look at the added value, the data that you're collecting, and making sure it's the right data that really helps you to put things into context and to understand whether you're having progress or not. And that's something, I guess, that the industry is very well advised to do that. Look at the right data and make sure that with it, data at hand, you manage your risk properly, you have informed decisions going forward. That's very high on the agenda for, I guess, every lender, every investor in the aviation industry.
Yeah, shifting the view from data and reporting from a burden more to using it as an advantage, because in the end, the right data can actually give you a big advantage on minimizing your risk as well. So I think that was a good closing statement or note that you brought here. So yeah, thank you so much for taking the time, Ulrike, and for sharing all of this on Impact's story, Impact's position, and what you think Impact can contribute to the missing gaps in the industry. And anyone who watched or listened, please, if you have any questions, reach out. Ulrike, I assume, is happy to respond to them. And with that, I am saying a warm goodbye to everyone. And until next time, thank you, Ulrike. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Leonie. Thanks for having me. Bye.